The other one just wasn't, so I had to like write them out.
All right. Welcome back from coffee. I am excited to announce our next speaker, Cameron Buckner. Cameron Buckner is a philosopher at the University of Houston. He specializes in philosophy of AI and machine learning, informed by cognition and comparative cognition. He has written much on representation in deep learning neural networks and is currently working on a book on empiricist concepts of cognitive faculties and their analogs in machine learning.
Okay, thank you. I'm always happy to come back to Cincinnati and talk to the fantastic group here, and I'm really enjoying meeting the other members of the workshop. It's a great event. So I'm just going to talk today about basic framing of my book projects. It's kind of advertisement. If you want to talk to me about some of the other details, here's the general game. And the basic frame is, suppose we agreed with some of the critiques of what deep learning can do now, what should be the next steps in trying to bootstrap up to the greater levels of higher cognition or flexibility or sophistication, whatever. I worry that the debate that shapes up between sort of DNN proponents and DNN skeptics is often misframed. And it's often misframed in a philosophical way. So in particular, both sides are invoking this rationalism, empiricism frame for the debate, and I worry that there's a lot of talking past that happens as a result. So basically what I'm pitching in this short, for my purposes of talk, is how to think about the rules of the game going forward, and then I'll gesture at some of the stuff I do later in the book. But I hope that before we engage further in this great debate about how to reach the next levels of cognitive sophistication and higher cognition, with or without deep neural networks, we can get the philosophical framing right so that we're being a bit more productive in our debates. So I'm basically going to line up different ways you could apply the rationalist empiricist debate to the current research in deep neural networks as a method in AI and what the stakes of that might be. Let me close this because that was driving me crazy in previous talks. Okay. And in particular, I'm going to suggest a new frame for the way of thinking of the divide between the two camps in terms of domain-specific versus domain-general learning mechanisms. I think that's the useful way to set the terms of the game. And then I'm going to recommend and make a bit of a case for a particular moderately empiricist approach to future progress in that. So it's kind of, I'm placing my bets in a particular direction that I think will be the most productive going forward and say what that is. So I probably don't need to tell this group, deep learning has done a bunch of stuff lately that seems pretty cool. AlphaGo, AlphaFold, a bunch of stuff. I don't have to go on about this. But for my philosophical purposes, what's particularly interesting about this, it seems like we can't help but think about these achievements in the context of philosophy, in particular, this empiricism rationalism frame. So if you look at the AlphaGo go paper, they, in particular, in the first sentence of the abstract, they invoke this tabula rasa language, right? They say we used a tabula rasa algorithm. It's a famous mantra of empiricism going all the way back to Aristotle, up through Aquinas, and often associated most with John Locke and David Hume. And the skeptics also seem to endorse this frame. So Gary Marcus, in particular, has this well-known paper where he criticizes deep learning achievements, in particular AlphaGo and AlphaZero, for not having enough innate structure. In other words, not having enough rationalism of the traditional sort of Cartesian or Leibnizian variety. So it's not me invoking philosophy upon the debate. It seems like we just can't help but see it in these terms. So this is invoking this grand dichotomy between nature and nurture. Goes all the way back to debates between Plato and Aristotle in ancient Greek philosophy, at least, probably a lot before. And there's reasons to be very concerned whenever one of these sort of grand dichotomies shows up in your debate, because they can be interpreted in lots of different ways by different people, right? In particular, this one is like one of the most notorious. Some version of a nature-nurture dispute has showed up in basically every area of human inquiry. Every academic discipline has some version of a rationalism, empiricism debate, and they often generate sort of strong intuitions, right, and maybe even emotional reactions in different camps. In particular, in biology, right, you might know, you might be worried this is a place where the nature-nurture debate generated maybe more heat and smoke than utility. And today we want to say, like, everything is actually just nature and nurture. Stop mongering this old dichotomy on us. And we don't want the same thing to happen in AI, right? So we don't want to replicate the kind of talking past mistakes from other areas. However, these grand dichotomies can also inspire maybe some great scientific breakthroughs. So the philosopher of science, John Norton, for example, has documented how Albert Einstein thinks that his reading of Hume's concept, empiricism, was just essential in helping him reach the breakthrough to relativity theory, right? The idea being that if even our concepts of space-time weren't innate, but were rather learned from experience, then maybe even they could be revised in extreme conditions like approaching the speed of light. And rationalism has similarly been very influential in inspiring some of the great scientific achievements of the 20th century, maybe famously Cartesian linguistics from Noam Chomsky, explicitly invoking the rationalism of Descartes, the idea that we have an innate grammar, right? So it seems like even though these dichotomies have a lot of danger to them, they can sometimes be productive if we're careful in how we apply them. But so the debate, as I said, it goes all the way back to ancient Greece, and some version of it has been fought, over the past few thousand years. You might worry that there's not that much progress being made in the various incarnations of the debate in various fields, right? They always seem, every time you think like rationalism gets the upper hand, empiricism seems to strike back, and vice versa, where we're not actually accruing progress. But one of the things that's cool about the present debate is that we can now treat it as kind of like an empirical question. So in particular, we can build a bunch of robots according to rationalist principles and build a bunch of robots according to empiricist principles and just see which ones are more successful or human-like, right? And to the victor go the spoils. So maybe there's an opportunity here to treat one of these timeless philosophical questions as sort of an empirical question that can be resolved with engineering methodology, properly philosophically informed, right? And in fact, you see this frame being endorsed by prominent members of both sides, Judea Pearl in particular here, who worries that deep learning is inspired by kind of radical empiricism. That's not very plausible. And in this influential critical article of deep learning by Lake and other co-authors, they also invoke the empiricist frame. So they say, in particular, Turing early on in computer science was inspired by this sort of empiricist blank slate methodology. And they say this view on representation and learning echoes behaviorism, the dominant psychological prediction of Turing's time. And then they later go on to say cognitive science repudiated the oversimplified behaviorist view and came to play a central role in early AI research. I'm already getting a bit nervous here. You'll see why, hopefully, in a minute. This is a very common kind of jump to say deep learning, empiricism, behaviorism, resoundingly defeated forever. We shouldn't talk about this. And that's the series of inferences I want to question. You see it sort of popping up all over the place. It's a very common kind of motif. First thing I want to do before we do further, though, is to point out that because this has been such a deep dualism, there are many different dimensions or incarnations of the nature-nurture debate, and I sort of want to introduce the other ones just to put them aside and say, like, that's not what I'm talking about, or I don't think that's the useful way to understand it here. So if you liked psychological behaviorism, for example, I think that's actually more aligned with a kind of knowledge empiricism, that is an empiricism about justification. So the idea that you can only theorize about causes which can be justified in terms of sensory experience. I'm not saying anything about justification today, so set the debate over knowledge or justification aside. There's also, if you like, a logical positivists like Carnap and his buddies, then you might be thinking about semantic empiricism, or the doctrine that, say, meaningful claims can all be translated into claims about sensory experience. I'm also not making any claims about the meanings of useful theoretical terms, so set that all to the side. It's important to do this because I find that people's initial exposure to a rationalism empiricism debate is very sticky, and it's hard to get them to talk about the version of it that you want to unless you set these other ways of thinking about it aside. So I'm talking in particular about what I call concept empiricism, or you might talk about origin empiricism. So it's a doctrine only about the mind's representations, in particular their causal origins. And the idea is that these representations and their structure originate in experience. The raw materials for representations needs to come from sensory experience. So it's just about the origins of the mind's representations. I think this is the primary form of empiricism you actually find in the canonical empiricists like Locke and Hume. And it's just a denial that there are innate ideas or concepts. What does innate mean here? You know, we could do a whole 2-hour lecture about this. This has been another notoriously difficult thing to pin down. Here's a citation dump if you want to get into it. If you're a philosophy or psychology graduate student. But at least for the present purposes, it means not learned. So the representations, if they're innate, are not going to be learned by whatever learning algorithm your deep neural network applies. So the basic question here, the question that I think is the debate that we should explore, is what is the origin of abstract knowledge for either deep neural networks that are sufficiently human-like or in human or animal experience? Are they innate, or do they originate from sensory experience? You could take an example like the idea of a triangle, is what I've talked about in some of my papers. That's the question. Okay, and there's significant controversy on the topic of whether deep neural networks can actually learn any such abstractions, to the degree that it seems like some people take it as just like obvious that they can't, and other people take it as just like patently obvious that they can. And this is very puzzling to me. It suggests that there must be some talking past going on. So like there was a session on this at NERIT 2020 with some big names, and where most of the people in that session were very skeptical that DNNs could learn any meaningful abstractions. And nevertheless, in like the flagship deep learning paper by the triumvirate, I sometimes call them, the very first sentence, again, of the abstract, they say exactly the way deep learning works is by learning abstractions from the data, right? Building them up from simpler components. So there's probably very different notions of abstraction at play here. If we look at some of the specific skeptical takes, like Melanie Mitchell says, forming abstractions is one of the key AI abilities listed in the Dartmouth AI proposal, kind of the Magna Carta for AI. However, enabling machines to form human-like conceptual abstractions is still almost completely unsolved, so very skeptical. Marcus says, knowledge represented in deep learning systems pertains mainly to largely opaque correlations between features rather than abstractions like quantified statements. And there you get a universally quantified statement of logic, you might think. Chalet has a kind of interesting hybrid position. This is probably closer to my position, for whatever it's worth. There are two forms of abstraction in human cognition, one found in intuition and perception, and another which drives explicit deductive reasoning and higher cognition, which remains the fundamental weakness of current DNN models. So maybe there's two different forms of abstraction, and deep learning can do one of them. What I really want to do for the rest of the talk is focus on what exactly is the kind or strain of empiricism that should be seen to inspire and maybe in turn be empirically bolstered by some of deep learning's recent engineering achievements. Now, first, I'm gonna give you what the skeptics think is the kind of empiricism which will largely be rejected. So if you look at Steven Pinker, for example, he thinks that empiricists believe that the mind is a complete blank slate, like a very extreme notion of what it means to be a blank slate with no structure whatsoever. And he kind of dismisses this view as saying, like, blank slates just don't do anything, right? They're not going to learn anything from any amount of experience. It's like throwing experience at a rock. It's not going to do anything. Gary Marcus, in one of his papers, kind of provides a formal scaffolding for this view. He says, one might think of cognition as a function over four variables, A, R, K, and E, where A is innate algorithms, R is innate representational formats, K is innate knowledge, and E is experience. A true blank slate would set K and R to 0, A to some extremely minimal value, like a single learning rule, and leave the rest to experience. And then he says, this is essentially the view that Locke articulated when he says all ideas come from sensation or reflection. All I would say is if you've read any Locke, that is not Locke's view, right? Even in the next few pages, in particular, relevant to my theme, Locke invokes a lot of other stuff in the mind. Memory, imagination, attention, will, all these other faculties show up in Locke's stories about how we extract abstractions from sensory experience. And so that's the thing I think that's largely missing from this straw man type view of the kind of empiricism that's being attributed to deep learning. So basically what they're doing is, they say, is this deep learning? And then they see it's just a re-arbitrating of this debate between psychological behaviorism and cognitivism and cognitive science, rehashing this kind of old debate that they think the cognitivists resoundingly won, when really the deep learning is not just Skinner. And Locke and Hume are not just Skinner, right? Maybe even Skinner wasn't just Skinner on this reading of Skinner. Nobody thought that the mind had no innate structure whatsoever. They were interested in the origins of just the mind's representations. So I think the idea is that anybody who is remotely plausible and offered a version of empiricism about the mind thinks that you can have lots of innate domain general resources that can be called upon, in particular like cognitive architecture and domain general faculties to explain how the mind might do what it does. So nativist philosophers Lawrence and Margolis, if you're looking for somebody to read on this, they're in the nativist camp, but they look at their other nativists and they say, come on, everybody, we're not setting up a useful debate here because nobody's ever had this strongman empiricist view. Really, the debate should be set up between domain general learning systems and domain specific learning systems, right? Or domain specific concepts, right? So the idea is, where do the abstractions come from? Are they coming primarily from specialized systems, maybe been tailored highly by evolution or genetic factors to very specific types of problems, a more evolutionary psychology inspired view maybe? Or are they the result of very domain general resources being repeatedly engaged, things like attention, memory, imagination, will, interest? If you want to try to index what do I actually mean by domain specific or domain general, there's a tradition of cashing this out in terms of the range of inputs to which the mechanism responds. Fodor actually says the range of questions to which it provides answers, and maybe there's something turning on that. We can maybe come to that in the Q&A. But the idea is that a domain-specific mechanism is only going to respond usefully to some very limited range of inputs, like a face detection module would only respond to faces. And a domain general mechanism like memory, you can store basically any type of content in memory, let's say. It makes it domain general. And so just to drive the point home that, even Locke didn't have this view, the encyclopedia entry on Locke ably says, well, the mind may be a blank slate in regards to content. It's plain Locke thinks we're born with a variety of faculties to receive and abilities to manipulate or process the content once we acquire it. Thus, the mind can engage in different types of putting ideas together, which he later calls abstraction, forms of abstraction. In addition to these abilities, there's faculties like memory, imagination. So just to give another example, like here's a taxonomy from Hume scholar Millikan about Hume's faculty psychology. You can see there's a lot of stuff that you don't think necessarily has to be learned, but that can be applied actively on experience to extract specific abstractions. Now, what do the nativists today think is missing? Well, the refrain you hear again and again is that core knowledge is what's missing. So this is invoking some work by developmental psychologists, especially Susan Carey and Elizabeth Spelke. The idea being that you need some set of core systems for recognizing abstract properties or relations in the world, things like intuitive physics, theory of mind, basic systems for number, arithmetic, and naive logic maybe. And to get those systems off the ground, you need at least some small number of innate domain-specific concepts. This is actually quite a bit more domain general than a lot of other nativist hypotheses, even from the last 20 or 30 years. But this is the one that's most popular in critics of deep learning today. They all say, you need to build in core knowledge if you're going to get more human-like results. Some other specific nativist views, if you're curious, so like Fodor in the 70s notoriously said that like all simple concepts are innate, including things like carburetor and beatnik. It's a funny story to figure out what he actually meant by that, but Chomsky is also seen as often having one of the most extreme nativist views, at least in his middle incarnations, where you've got a universal grammar with potentially hundreds of innate rules and parameters that need to be set to get an explanation for human grammatical ability. Lawrence and Margolis are a little bit more moderate in their nativism. They say we might have domain-specific systems for biologically significant categories like objects, physical causation, distance, goals, emotions, life stages, disease, prey food, still a pretty expansive set. Marcus mostly goes just for core knowledge, but also conceptual primitives for like sets, locations, trajectories, obstacles, a few others. And maybe today Chomsky and Berwick they just want merge. Like, just merge, can we have just merge? Where that's a particular rule for joining structured set items. So it looks like there's been kind of a steady retreat. I don't know what happened in the 70s, but there was kind of a steady retreat from the most expansive forms of nativism to more minimal ones now, maybe in response to advances in neural network type approaches to the mind. So the moderately empiricist alternative that I want to endorse, and I think is kind of actually driving a lot of the modeling efforts in deep learning, and is in turn bolstered by their achievements, is the idea that we have domain general faculties that are governed by domain general inductive biases that are implemented through sort of broadly, vaguely brain-like, neurally plausible structures at some level of abstraction, like wiring motifs, architectural constraints, global parameters like learning rates, in a variety of domain general modules are sufficient to extract domain-specific abstractions from rich structured environmental input. And you can find kind of like statements of this as a position from some prominent deep learning or older generation connectionist modelers like McClelland or Hassabis, Botvinnik in a few of these papers, if you're curious. And they think there's a significant benefit. So like you might say, well, if we agree that a lot of the same abstractions are learned, say the nativists and the empiricists think that a lot of the same abstractions are learned at the end of the day, whether through extraction from experience or by building in innate, the empiricists here still think that there's a benefit to extracting them from experience because they have a different structure and they have different properties of generalizing, in particular across domains, right? So you might think about generalizing, getting like free generalization across space to temporal domains, or from space and temporal domains to taxonomic hierarchies. If you're using domain general inductive biases to do those things, you might get some of those generalizations for free. Goyal and Bengio give a recent table here of some of the domain general inductive biases that they think should be built into networks to reach higher cognition. This is kind of a very speculative article, but it's more evidence that this is actually the kind of empiricism they endorse, which is the main thing I'm arguing for right now. Rather than very domain-specific things, these are all quite general. So one way to understand the debate is not as like two extremes between a fight between radical nativism and radical empiricism. That's the bad way of thinking about it. But rather as a big continuum where the main variable along the continuum is how many domain-specific structures do you think need to be built in to get human-like cognition out at the end of it, with, I think, empiricism largely having won the field, at least if you have the continuum defined by the polls of some of the excesses of like the 70s. And so most of the 5 years between, let's say DeepMind being indexed here very, very far on the empiricist spectrum, but thinking that you need like a few modules that implement a few domain general inductive biases. And maybe the most empirically plausible today or worth investigating today, you being like a core knowledge where you just get a few innate concepts like space, cause, and so on. I do want to give a little bit of caution here about core knowledge. So one thing that's been a little bit troubling to me is that in the deep learning debates, everybody seems to take it just as like empirical consensus that core knowledge is established beyond doubt. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's a hypothesis, it's worth investigating. But the replication crisis in psychology has not been especially kind to this area of developmental psychology. And I think people might want to wait for the dust to settle here. And I also think some of the other, one of the other biggest lines of evidence that was thought to support core knowledge, in particular controlled rearing studies, has started going in the other direction, actually looking like it's providing more evidence for empiricism rather than core knowledge nativism here. So the early infant behavioral studies, for example, that purport to show that very young infants, sometimes as young as 4 months, can do things like false belief attribution, object permanence, imitation, and animacy biases. A lot of these studies have been called into question by calling into question the ambiguous measure. They all rely on looking time, which can mean different things in different contexts. A lot of the studies are underpowered now by replication failure standards today. There have been a lot of explicit replication failures, and a lot of them failed to control for some important environmental cues. If you want some reviews of some of the replication failures or methodological concerns, these are some good papers. And there is a reform movement underway today, so I don't want to be like totally pessimistic. In particular, this Many Babies Consortium movement is one of these big like replicability pushes where they try to get much larger N's so they have much more statistical power to investigate like which of these effects are real and which ones maybe aren't. So, you know, stay tuned, but maybe we want to not insist on at least very particular findings that up until now you might have thought were empirically consensus. The controlled rearing studies, I think, are starting to actually turn in the other direction too. So this is where you say take a newly hatched chick or a newly hatched duckling, and you try to automate the process as much as possible, and then you see what kinds of core knowledge abilities do these newly hatched animals that purportedly have no experience can exhibit. And this was originally for a long time thought to provide maybe the strongest evidence for core knowledge as being very widely distributed in the animal kingdom. The first thing I would say is like all researchers should be forced in AI to read this Lerman 1953 paper, a critique of Konrad Lorenz's theory of instinct. And the main thing being there that like learning even starts inside the egg. Read the paper, that's the basic pitch. I hope that entices you enough to dig deeper into it. But recent controlled rearing studies have shown that some of the mechanisms that we thought were the strongest evidence for core knowledge actually are much more domain general than we would have thought. So some cool results recently are that like ducks can imprint on higher order relations like sameness and difference, right? So you might have imprinting is this phenomena where the duck pops out of the egg, right? And then sees the mother's face, and then it's going to follow whatever it sees. We already knew that this was more flexible than just a mother detection mechanism. That's the very domain specific way of describing this mechanism. Because like Konrad Lorenz's famous studies of imprinting, the ducks followed him. He was not their mother, right? But the fact that we can imprint newly hatched ducklings on a higher order sameness relation, right? So like they think their mother is the sameness relation, or is this actually just a domain general learning mechanism that gives you highly specialized learning on whatever you see right after you pop out of the egg? And it's actually the environment, the thing the empiricist always wants to emphasize is providing the regularity to get the ecologically useful result out of this imprinting mechanism in most cases. Also, there's other research showing that chicks can imprint on abstract multimodal patterns, so the stuff that just goes well beyond what a mother is in the duck's life. So these are some examples of the stimuli that these ducks follow around. You could change the color, for example, if it imprinted on same shape, relation, whatever, it would still follow it around. And the strongest evidence, and the coolest evidence for me is this Wood lab up the road at Indiana University. So Justin Wood was a student of Spelke and Carey, and his research sort of started out showing some of the strongest evidence for core knowledge in very young chicks. And he started this controlled rearing study where he would raise the chicks as soon as they hatched out of the egg, like machine-controlled conditions, the idea to control for all the confounds, and make sure that every chick saw like literally identical experience by raising them in these virtual environments, right? But then he got the idea like, well, what if I take a relatively generic deep convolutional neural network and I raise an artificial chick based on that network in the same structured experience? Would I get the same core knowledge effects in those deep convolutional neural networks, which are supposed to not have any innate domain-specific knowledge? And in fact, he's finding that he does. And so this was really surprising evidence to everybody. So, he finds a lot of the same effects that were taken to be evidence for core knowledge, innate core knowledge, in artificial chicks with relatively generic deep neural networks driving them, if you give them the same virtual experience that you show to the biological chicks in these controlled rearing studies. So that's very suggestive to me. There's also this movement in deep learning that I think is very nice to train deep neural networks on much more ecologically valid data, in particular recorded from head cams, learned from human infants during learning scenarios, and they're getting some cool effects there showing that, you know, if instead of training a deep neural network on like ImageNet, you actually train them on these video recorded from the head cams, you can get some more human-like, more efficient, exhibit some of the same biases in categorization that humans do. So again, the experience, the structure of the experience, early experience in particular, seems to be providing a bigger piece of the puzzle than we might have thought until recently. So why is the history of philosophy important here? Like, why should machine learning researchers care about, you know, getting Locke or Hume right? The thought is the question of empiricism versus rationalism is seen as having crucial consequences for engineering methodology. In particular, should we manually program core knowledge into systems using usually rules or symbols or classical or hybrid systems, or should we try to figure out ways to enable them to learn the abstractions themselves? But this connection is just not being drawn in the most productive way. Deep learning is not really inspired by B.F. Skinner. It's not just neo-behaviorism. It's rather the historical empiricists and their domain general faculty architectures. So I think also, and I didn't really make the case in this talk, but I try to make it at length in the book, is that especially as we start to build more complex cognitive architectures for deep learning agents, the things actually discovered by the empiricist philosophers might turn out to be more and more useful, especially as we confront like control problems. How do we coordinate like a memory module and an imagination module and an attention mechanism? How do we get all those things working together in the right way? These were actually problems that the empiricist philosophers thought long and hard about. So you might find some gems there. I'm out of time. I'll skip way ahead. How much time do I have left? 3 minutes? Okay. So one way to put the thrust of my argument is, what is the basic tenet of empiricism, right? So there are these cases, like there was this NYU debate between Marcus and LeCun, where Marcus said, you know, look, LeCun, you think you're empiricist, but your deep convolutional neural networks only work because they build in innate bias towards translational invariance. Isn't that just like the nativist innate idea of space? And I want to say, no, it's not, because you show you can get all this other stuff out of it that's not unique to the domain of space, and it's not coextensive with the stuff that was supposed to be implied by the nativist innate idea of space, which in the hands of like Leibniz or Descartes implied basically all of Euclidean geometry. They're just not the same types of hypotheses. One is much more domain general and flexible, and the other is much more domain specific. Where are the rationalists getting their unfortunate reading of empiricism, though? You often can trace it back to some simple mantra of empiricism, like Hume's copy principle is something you often find cited. This is like what Fodor often goes back to if you're trying to read Fodor to figure out what Hume was saying, where Hume said all our simple ideas in their first appearance are derived from simple sensory impressions which are correspondent to them and which they exactly represent. When rationalists read this statement, I think they're reading like it's just a literal copy, right? It's got to just be an exact duplication. I don't think that's what Hume meant all along, or even what a lot of the other empiricists meant. So Hume, for example, says, speaking of the faculty of the imagination, in the inquiry, he says, nothing's more free than the imagination of man, and though it cannot exceed the original stock of ideas furnished by the internal and external senses, it has unlimited power of mixing, compounding, separating, and dividing these ideas in all the varieties of fiction and vision. Tomas Demeter has this great paper on rebutting Fodor's interpretation of Hume here. And I think everybody reads Hume and Locke and other empiricists like they're trying to give a kind of simple billiard ball law-based physics for the mind. And Demeter says, no, the right model is rather like mental chemistry. Okay, that you can get simple ideas when they're combined together by the faculties. They can have properties that are novel as a result of the compound, that are not just additive from the simple constituents that go into it. And so I encourage everybody to read that paper if you're curious about this. But then the idea is we can use these deep neural networks, you know, like GANs for the imagination, for example. That's what I do in that chapter, for cashing out some of these promissory notes. Hume had no explanation whatsoever of how the imagination could do some of these compounding operations that he draws upon all over the place in the treatise and the inquiry. But we might be able to use deep neural network models like GANs or transformers to suggest how some of these novel combinations might be made. So I suggest that the basic tenet should be instead called the transformation principle, which just makes this productive property clear, that the mind's simple concepts are derived from systematic domain general transformations of sensory impressions. So as long as you're getting all the raw material for the representations from sensory experience, whatever you can derive from them through domain general transformations counts as something that's fair game for empiricists. So that's the way to define like what's allowed to be empiricist and what's not. I'll skip ahead since I'm out of time. So the idea is the faculties are going to sort of come to the rescue in rebutting some of the generic criticisms of deep learning. So the idea is that like perception, maybe as implemented in a deep convolutional neural network, is going to implement forms of abstraction to extract translation in variant categories from complex experience. Memory is going to allow us to replay successful experience trajectories for offline learning and rapid consequence-sensitive decision-making. Imagination will allow us to compose novel ideas and experiences and choose on the basis of simulated experiences of future outcomes and engage in offline simulated learning. And there's various ways that attentional mechanisms can make processing more efficient, maybe approximate variable role binding operations, another idea. Bind features together into whole and solve some coordination and control problems across modules. These are projects that I explore in individual chapters of the book. So this is just the advertising part. So the idea of the book project is that I show how initial attempts to model some roles attributed to these faculties have already been done, at least early efforts, using different types of deep neural network architectures like ECNNs for perception or GANs for imagination. And then I tie what's done there to an empiricist philosopher who had a particularly interesting take on how that faculty works in bootstrapping higher cognition and rational decision making. So if you're interested in any of that, just talk to me later. I call this the new empiricist dogma, because you have to have a cool acronym for computer scientists to take you seriously. So this stands for Domain General Modular Architecture. And I like that it's, sounds dogmatic because it's like a sword of Damocles hanging over our heads, that we should remember to actually not be dogmatic about it, right? It should only be as long as we're continuing to make good sense of experience, evidence, empirical evidence, and continuing to produce new engineering results, that we should defend this. And if the tide turns the other way, then we should give it up. Don't be dogmatic about it. Okay, so the takeaways, enough already with the association of straw persons. All serious empiricists get active domain general faculties. The dominant view in DL should actually be seen as this new empiricist dogma rather than neo-Skinner. And empiricist DNN researchers should start thinking more systematically about how these faculties function and can be integrated together into coherent cognitive architecture. By the way, a bunch of empiricist philosophers have thought a lot about this. If you want more details, I have some papers here, or you can ask me for book chapters, which are reasonably far along. Thanks. Are we out of time for questions? Nope.
I'm computer science, and I'm not a philosopher, but I seem to have read some time ago when humans uniformly imagine principle. The things cannot constay, the mind is bad. So, my mind, for example, just text.
Yeah. Yeah, so what Hume was doing there, this is part of his analysis of what he calls the problems of induction, right? The idea that inductive inference is you make this uniformity assumption when you're reasoning to make predictions about the future on the basis that the future is going to resemble the past, and that's supposed to be one of the things that justifies inductive reasoning. And Hume had a kind of famously skeptical take on this, saying that like nothing actually justifies, or provides evidence that the future will resemble the past. But nevertheless, it works pretty well most of the time. So like the laid back reading of Hume reads him as being like, yes, we don't have any foundational justification for that, but it's okay, don't worry, chill out, and just keep making inductive inferences. And you're exactly right that there's a tight fit, I've written some stuff about this in the past, between this basic framing of the problem of induction and the basic framework of machine learning. So, there's a number of ways. That's one. Yeah, sorry?
But what I was trying to say is that if you think about that uniformity in nature, principle, I think it's so then the more we see, for instance, examples of something, the more we expect that thing to be like
yeah.
in that sense.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. I think there is indeed a tight fit between the way Hume looked at induction to, yeah, and it goes even further than that. Like I have a Nature Machine Intelligence article where I draw a bunch of other ties between other takes on the problem of induction by philosophers, like in particular Nelson Goodman, and some of the other problems that have come up in machine learning more recently, especially adversarial examples. And there's lots of other very interesting ties there. I think they're conceptually closely related.
Right, so, okay, I was not a first, but I'm AI guy. So my question is that you sort of took the empiricist versus innate, and then tried to kind of make it more smoother and said it's not like zero knowledge versus full knowledge. But there's another way of also doing the spectrum, which is it's not infeasible, infeasible versus radically inefficient.
Yeah.
And so the question,
Yeah.
start thinking about efficiency aspects.
Yeah.
Right? Clearly, I mean, since we are here, and evolution got us here, clearly it should be possible that everything will work out without control. But on the other hand, I don't know that I want evolution to happen every time I'm working with a machine. And so when you start thinking about this, especially if you consider tacit versus explicit tasks, for tacit tasks, we have nothing to tell the machines. For explicit tasks, we do have a lot more than just the architectural biases to give the machines. And so, in fact, when you showed Joshua's, the table as well as what you were saying, you said domain in general, you tended to give examples of basically just architectural biases. But you can actually provide advice that's, the levels of abstraction could be very directly related to this task, or maybe related to 5 different tasks. None of these are related with architecture changes alone. So it seems to me that that is also what we do. Once you do that, this whole dichotomy becomes out of focus, because I think part of what you're pointing out is that the dichotomy is from, at least the way I find the dichotomy have to be there. You are considering the main general knowledge. But I am just saying that that generality doesn't have to just architectural biases. Maybe it could be more than like providing advice. Like the McCarthy's original dream for AI is advising to machines.
Mm-hmm.
And that might be another way. And that actually, in the case of most of the examples that we have are perception examples, we really have nothing to give to the machines because we don't know how to do perception. But we do know a lot more about a lot of other explicit knowledge tasks that we have come up with. And I'm sure if you let the machines run for a long time, they might get there. But it seems to me take efficiency might consider more sorts of.
Yeah, I get the question. Thank you. So yeah, the modeler can sort of do whatever they want with their model, right? The modeler could say like, I don't care how human children actually learn to do this from birth. I just want to, given the kind of basic background knowledge I can anticipate any or the average adult subject in my psychological experiment would bring to the table, I can just build that knowledge into my machine and then see if the model learns to do the task about as well as they do. There's nothing like wrong with that. I mean, they can do that. Most of what I was pitching in the talk was like trying to figure out like what actually is human-like learning, or what is the nature of human-like intelligence or intelligence sort of generally, where you're not just interested, can I produce human-like behavior by building in the intelligent part manually, but actually make a system that learns to do the intelligent activity on its own. And that's the question that I'm mostly interested in, and I think that the empiricists were mostly interested in. That's not saying that that's like the only question you could ask for other research purposes, or like if you had a purely practical goal, you just wanted to make a system that does a particular task well, then yeah, why not build in a bunch of knowledge that you're pretty sure that the system is going to need and you think is basically right. That's fine. It's a more like cognitive modeling, intelligence modeling question that I've been trying to answer here. But similarly, on the other side, like you wouldn't want to reprise like the whole process of evolution. That's another bone that sometimes gets thrown to the empiricists here that I think people like DeepMind and so on reject. They say like, no, I don't want you to interpret my training process as reprising the entire process of evolution parameter search. What I really want to do when I will win is when I've made something that can learn like a human child can learn to do the intelligent tasks that humans can do. That's when the empiricist is going to think.
But except that human children will take advice, so which is very task specific.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's actually one of the biggest pieces that's missing actually from current deep learning is the ability to take like structured, guided instruction from humans. I think that's something we should be spending a lot more time trying to figure out.
We should probably. Yeah, well, sorry to cut you guys off, but we should probably. We're already running a good bit behind schedule. I want to keep to that, so we'll discuss more tomorrow. Thank you. Okay. So.
Cigarette.